I am your host, Nero Wolfe. Let's begin our journey.
I was at my desk, keeping the bank balance from feeling neglected, and wondering if Fritz would let me have a look at the ham he'd been curing, when the doorbell rang. It was exactly 11:06 Thursday morning. Up in the plant rooms, Nero Wolfe was currently engaged in the only activity he considers truly sacred, spending 2 hours with 10,000 orchids and a man named Theodore Horstman. Between 9 and 11 in the morning, the rest of the world could sink into the Atlantic for all Wolfe cared, provided the water didn't reach the roof. I went to the front door, checked the one-way glass, and saw a woman who looked like she had been carved out of a very expensive block of ice. She was wearing a tailored wool coat in a shade of grey that shouted Upper East Side, and a hat that probably cost more than my first 2 years of salary. She wasn't pacing and she wasn't fidgeting, she was just standing there, looking at the door as if it were a disobedient child that needed to open itself immediately. I opened it. "Good morning. If you're here to donate to the Police Athletic League, I can take the check. If you're looking for Mr. Wolfe, he's currently 3 stories up and unavailable for anything short of a planetary collision." She looked at me and her eyes were the color of a winter sky over the Hudson. "I am Mrs. Evelyn Sterling Vane, and the collision has already occurred, Mr. Goodwin. It just hasn't made any noise yet." I knew the name. The Sterling Vanes were the kind of people who didn't just have money, they had history. They owned pieces of Manhattan the way other people own postage stamps. "Well, Mrs. Sterling Vane, history or not, Wolfe doesn't come down until 11. You can come in and wait, but I should warn you the chairs are comfortable and the silence is mandatory." I led her into the office. She sat in the red leather chair, the one where people usually sit when they're about to tell us how they've been, swindled, or why they think they're about to be murdered. She didn't look like either. She looked like she was waiting for a board meeting to start. "I have been told Mr. Wolfe is the only man in New York with a brain that functions without the interference of emotion," she said, her voice cool and steady. "I hope that is true. I am not here for a crime that has been committed. I am here because of a crime that is being rehearsed." "Rehearsed?" I sat at my desk and pulled a notepad toward me. "Most people wait for the opening night before they call us. It's cheaper that way. The opening night is Christmas Eve," she said. 4 days from now. My family holds a silent auction every year at our estate in Riverdale. This year, the centerpiece is the Star of Aquitaine, a sapphire that has been in the family for 3 generations. It is currently in a vault at the estate. Yesterday, someone replaced the security code on the inner chamber. It wasn't the security firm. It wasn't me. And yet, nothing was taken. "Maybe they just wanted to see if they could do it," I suggested. "A little pre-holiday exercise." "No, they left something behind. A small wooden toy soldier. It was standing on the empty pedestal next to the sapphire." I looked at her. "A toy soldier? Any particular rank?" "An infantryman," she said. "But it was painted in the colors of the Sterling Vane livery, blue and gold. It's a message, Mr. Goodwin. Someone tells me they are already in my house, that they have breached the silent night." The elevator hummed and groaned in the distance, the sound of 285 pounds of genius descending from the heavens. A moment later, Nero Wolfe entered the room. He didn't look at our visitor. He walked to his desk, adjusted the blotter by a 1/16 of an inch, and sat. Only then did he turn his obsidian eyes toward the woman in the red chair. "Archie," Wolfe said, his voice a deep, resonant rumble. "There is a woman in the office. This is Mrs. Evelyn Sterling Vane," I said. "She's got a vault that's been hacked, a sapphire worth a fortune, and a toy soldier that wasn't there when she went to bed. She says the crime hasn't happened yet." Wolfe sighed, a sound that conveyed a profound weariness with the human race. "If the crime hasn't happened, madam, there is no need for my intervention. I am not a governess for nervous heiresses." "I am not nervous, Mr. Wolfe," she replied, matching his tone perfectly. "I am insulted. Someone has treated my home as a playground. I will pay your full retainer, $10,000, simply to identify the person who entered that vault. Whether you recover the stone later is immaterial. I want the intruder." Wolfe's eyes flickered. $10,000 for a name was the kind of arithmetic he liked, even if he pretended to loathe the interruption. 10,000, he repeated. He poured a glass of beer from the tray Fritz had just brought in, watching the foam with intense concentration. "Archie, get the details, and tell Fritz that for lunch I want the omelette aux fines herbs. I have a feeling the next few days will require a very delicate touch." I looked at Mrs. Sterling Vane. She had gotten what she wanted. But as I watched Wolfe sip his beer, I realized he hadn't taken the case for the money. He'd taken it because of the toy soldier. In Wolfe's world, a breach of a vault wasn't just a theft. It was a challenge to the idea of a private sanctuary. And if there's one thing Nero Wolfe doesn't tolerate, it's an uninvited guest. The office was suddenly crowded, not by the number of bodies, but by the weight of the personalities Mrs. Sterling Vane had seen fit to drag into our orbit. Nero Wolfe sat behind his desk, a vast continent of yellow silk and immovable resolve, while I played traffic cop. By 2 o'clock that afternoon, the brownstone had become a temporary annex of the Riverdale estate. Wolfe had permitted them entry for one reason: he refused to leave his chair for anything less than a national emergency, so the suspects had to be brought to the mountain. First in line was Julian Vane, Evelyn's stepson. He was a man who looked like he had been polished by a team of experts: perfect hair, a suit that breathed wealth, and a handshake that felt like wet cardboard. He sat on the edge of the yellow chair, looking around the office with the kind of thinly veiled contempt people use when they want you to know they're slumming it. He was followed by Claire Sterling, Evelyn's niece, a young woman with nervous eyes and a habit of twisting a diamond ring on her left hand until I thought her finger might fall off. Then came Marcus Thorne, the family's head of security, a man who looked like he'd been built out of old oak and stubbornness. He sat rigidly, his eyes fixed on Wolfe with the professional distrust of a man who didn't like outsiders poking at his failures. "So," Wolfe said, his voice a low vibration that seemed to make the beer bottles on his tray hum, "a toy soldier, a breach of a vault that requires a 16-digit rotating code and a biometric scan. And yet the sapphire remains. Why?" "It's a taunt," Marcus Thorne growled. He was leaning forward, his knuckles white. "Whoever did this wanted me to know that my system is garbage. They didn't take the star because they wanted to show they could take it whenever they felt like it. It's psychological warfare, Mr. Wolfe. Or a distraction," I put in, leaning against my desk. "Maybe the sapphire isn't the point. Maybe they were looking for something else in that vault. Papers, wills, a hidden stash of chocolate." Julian Vane gave a short, sharp laugh. "My father's estate is an open book, Goodwin. There are no secret papers. This is clearly a case of internal sabotage. Someone wants to embarrass Evelyn before the Christmas Eve gala. It's the year's biggest social event. If the star vanishes during the auction, the scandal would be permanent." "And who stands to benefit from such a scandal?" Wolfe asked, his eyes half closed. "Everyone and no one," Claire Sterling whispered. She finally stopped twisting her ring. "We're a family, Mr. Wolfe. That means we've spent 40 years perfecting the art of hating each other in polite tones. Any of us could have a reason. Julian wants the board seats. I want my trust fund released. Marcus wants to prove we need $1 million upgrade to the security system. It's a circle of motives." Wolfe shifted his weight, and the chair gave its customary groan of protest. He hadn't looked at the suspects yet. He was staring at the small wooden soldier Mrs. Sterling Vane had left on his desk. It was a crude thing, but as he said, the colors were precise, blue and gold, the colors of the house. "Mr. Thorne," Wolfe said, his eyes open, "you are the custodian of the vault. Who besides yourself and Mrs. Sterling Vane has the authorization to bypass the primary sensors?" Thorne hesitated. "On paper, nobody. But during the gala preparations, the system is put on a maintenance bypass for 2 hours every evening to allow the caterers and the insurance adjusters to move through the gallery. It's a vulnerability, but it's a necessary one. I'm always on site during those windows." "And where were you yesterday between 5 and 7 o'clock?" I asked. "I was in the gallery," Thorne snapped. "But I had to take a call from the perimeter gate. A delivery truck was blocked. I was gone for 6 minutes. When I came back, the bypass was still active, but the light on the inner chamber was red. I opened it, and there was that damn doll." "6 minutes," Wolfe murmured. "A lifetime for a man with a purpose." Julian, were you in the house at that time? I was in the library, Julian said smoothly, with 3 of the gala's committee members. We were discussing the seating chart. I have witnesses if you're interested in that sort of thing. I am interested in everything, Wolfe replied, and I am interested in nothing. Archie, the list. I handed him the sheet I'd prepared. I had the names of everyone who had been at the estate in the last 24 hours, the 4 suspects in the room, 3 caterers, a florist, and a man who came to tune the piano. It was a mess of possibilities, but Wolfe wasn't looking for a crowd. He was looking for the one person who knew the rhythm of the house well enough to dance between the raindrops of Marcus Thorne's security. You may all go, Wolfe said suddenly, waving a hand as if he were shooting flies. Archie will see you to the door. I have no more questions for the moment. That's it? Julian Vane stood, looking indignant. We drove all the way down here for 5 minutes of vague questioning. You drove here to be seen, Wolfe said, not looking up. And you have been seen. Good day. I led them out, enjoying the look of baffled fury on Julian's face. As the front door closed, the brownstone returned to its natural state of heavy intellectual silence. I went back into the office. Wolfe was staring at the toy soldier again. Well, I asked, are we going to wait for the opening night, or do I start pounding the pavement? The soldier is new, Archie, Wolfe said, his voice unusually soft. The wood is fresh, the paint is barely dry, but the design is 50 years old. It is a replica of a set that was sold at the 1974 World's Fair. Someone isn't just targeting the family. They are referencing a very specific moment in their history. Find out who was at that fair. And Archie, check the piano tuner. A man who listens for discordant notes is often the first to create them. Piano tuner, I muttered, grabbing my hat. Right, because the thief is probably going to play a concerto while he's cracking the safe. I'll be back for dinner, and I'm expecting something better than a toy soldier on my plate. The January wind was trying to peel the paint off the houses as I headed uptown, but my mind was stuck on a piece of wood painted blue and gold. Wolfe's remark about the 1974 World's Fair had seemed like one of his usual attempts to make a simple problem look like a cross-stitch pattern, but he was rarely wrong about the age of an insult. I spent the afternoon at a small, cramped office in the back of a music shop on 48th Street, talking to the man who had tuned the Sterling Vane piano. His name was Gottlieb, and he was so old he looked like he'd been seasoned in a humidor. Gottlieb confirmed he'd been at the estate during the security bypass, but he spent the entire time in the ballroom under the watchful eye of a footman who apparently took his job seriously. That scratched the piano tuner off the list of physical suspects, but it added a new layer to the geography of the house. If the staff was that vigilant, the intruder hadn't just walked in, they'd been invited, or they were part of the furniture. I spent the next 3 hours at the public library, digging through society archives and old newspapers. The Sterling Vanes had been a fixture of the 1974 fair. In fact, Evelyn's late husband, Silas, had been a primary sponsor of the International Peace Pavilion. There was a photo of him standing with a young Evelyn and a very small, very scowling Julian. In the background of the shot there was a display of those exact wooden soldiers. The caption mentioned a commemorative set gifted to the sponsors. By the time I got back to the brownstone, the streetlights were humming and the smell of roasting lamb was drifting from Fritz's kitchen. I walked into the office and found Wolfe exactly where I'd left him, though he had traded his beer for a book on 19th century naval history. He didn't look up as I sat at my desk and tossed my notebook onto the blotter. The piano tuner is a bust, I said. He's got an alibi and a footman to prove it. But you were right about the soldiers. They were a limited run for the 74 World's Fair. Silas Vane got a set. Only 12 sets were made. If our thief has one, they didn't buy it at a toy store. They inherited it or stole it from another sponsor. Wolfe closed his book, marking the place with a yellow silk ribbon. Inherited, a significant word, Archie. Did you check the list of the other 11 sponsors? I'm ahead of you, I said, pulling a folded slip of paper from my pocket. Of the 11 other families, only 3 are still in New York. 2 are broke and the third is the Thorne family. As in Marcus Thorne, the head of security who looked like he wanted to bite your head off this morning. Wolfe's eyelids flickered. Marcus Thorne, the man who was conveniently absent for 6 minutes during the bypass, the man whose father was Silas Vane's primary business rival before the merger of '78. The plot thickens, I said. Thorne isn't just an employee, he's a legacy hire. Evelyn kept him on because of some old family debt. But here's the kicker. Marcus's father died in a car accident 2 weeks after the fair ended. The Thorne family lost everything in the subsequent buyout by Silas Vane. Marcus grew up watching the Sterling Vanes live in the house that used to belong to his grandfather's associates. A motive of long standing, Wolfe murmured. But it's too obvious. A man like Marcus Thorne, trained in the nuances of security and protection, would not leave a signature that points so directly to his own lineage unless he was a fool, or unless he was being framed by someone who knows the history as well as he does. Which brings us back to the family, I noted. Julian Vane was at that fair. He was a kid, but he was, and Claire Sterling's mother was Silas's sister. They all know where the bodies are buried, and they all know Marcus's history. If Julian wants Marcus out of the way so he can hire his own security firm, one he likely owns a stake in, planting that soldier is a pretty sharp move. The doorbell rang, cutting our speculation. I checked the monitor and saw a man in a delivery uniform holding a large flat box. I went to the door expecting a late package for Wolfe's orchids, but the man didn't want a signature. He just handed me the box and vanished into the cold. I took the box into the office and opened it on the long table. Inside, resting on a bed of white tissue paper, was a second wooden soldier. This one wasn't an infantryman. It was a cavalry officer on a blue horse carrying a gold sabre, and pinned to its chest was a small, handwritten note on Sterling Vane stationery. The first watch has fallen. The second is already blind. Wolfe stood up, a rare and momentous event, and walked over to the table. He didn't touch the soldier. He looked at the handwriting on the note. It was elegant, slanted, and practiced. "Archie," Wolfe said, his voice dropping into that tone of cold authority that usually means someone is about to have a very bad week. "This is no longer a rehearsal. The intruder has entered this house, not physically perhaps, but they have breached the perimeter of our involvement. They are telling us that we are part of the play." "They sent it here?" I asked, feeling a genuine chill that had nothing to do with the weather. "Nobody knows we're in this case except the people who were in this room 3 hours ago." "Precisely," Wolfe said. "One of our guests left here, went to a craftsman or a hidden cache and dispatched this message. They are not afraid of me, Archie. They are inviting me to watch the star of Aquitaine vanish. It is a gesture of supreme arrogance." "So what's the move?" I asked. "Do I go back to Riverdale and start shaking trees?" "No," Wolfe said, returning to his chair. "If you shake the tree, the fruit will only hide. We must make the tree believe the season has changed. Call Saul Panzer. I want him at the Riverdale estate tonight, not as an investigator, but as a temporary waiter for the gala rehearsals. And Archie, call Mrs. Sterling Vane. Tell her that the fee is now 20,000, and that I require the original security logs from the night her husband died." I reached for the phone, my mind already running through the names. The geometry of the lie was getting complicated. We had a disgruntled security chief, a greedy stepson, and a nervous niece, all wrapped up in a 50-year-old grudge, and somewhere in that mix was a person clever enough to send a toy soldier to the most dangerous address in New York. The following morning the city was draped in a grey, freezing fog that made the Hudson look like a river of lead. I left Wolfe for his morning session in the plant rooms, where the humid, sweet air of the orchids was a world away from the cold steel of the Sterling Vane case, and headed for the Riverdale estate. If the brownstone had been breached by a delivery box, it was time I returned the favour by poking around the scene of the crime. The Sterling Vane mansion, known as Highstone, was a sprawling pile of granite and glass perched on a cliffside. It looked more like a fortress than a house, which made the presence of a wooden toy soldier in its heart even more of an embarrassment for Marcus Thorne. I didn't go through the front gates this time. I used the service entrance where Saul Panzer was already entrenched as a temporary hire for the gala's catering staff. I found him in the pantry wearing a white coat that was a size too large and looking exactly like a man who had spent his life polishing silver instead of tails. "The place is a sieve, Archie," Saul whispered as he handed me a cup of lukewarm coffee. "The security is top-notch on the doors, but the people are the problem. There's a backstair culture here that would make a soap opera look boring. Julian Vane has been in and out of the library 4 times this morning, looking for something in the floorboards. And the niece, Claire, she's been crying in the conservatory since breakfast." "What about Thorne?" I asked, leaning against a rack of crystal stemware. "He's a ghost. He spends all his time in the security hub, watching the monitors as if he expects the walls to start talking. He hasn't slept, Archie, you can see it in his eyes. He's waiting for the next soldier to drop." I left Saul to his work and made my way toward the main gallery. I was looking for the geometry of the house, the physical paths that led to the vault. The vault itself was a masterpiece of intimidation, a slab of brushed steel set into a wall of Tennessee marble. I stood there for a moment, imagining the intruder. To get in here during the bypass, you'd need more than a code. You'd need to know exactly when Marcus Thorne's attention was diverted. 6 minutes isn't much time to open a vault, place a toy and vanish, unless you were already standing right behind the door. I was interrupted by Julian Vane, who appeared at the end of the gallery looking like he'd just swallowed a lemon. "Mr. Goodwin, I didn't realize Mr. Wolfe's legwork involved loitering in my hallway. Have you found the phantom yet, or are you just admiring the marble?" "I'm admiring the timing, Mr. Vane," I said, turning to face him. "Your father was a big fan of the World's Fair, wasn't he? He liked things that were built to last, like this vault. It's a shame the same can't be said for family peace." Julian's eyes narrowed. "My father was a visionary. This house is his monument. If someone is trying to tarnish it with these ridiculous toys, I want them stopped. But I suspect Wolfe is more interested in the $20,000 fee than the truth." "Wolfe is interested in people who think they're smarter than he is," I replied. "It's a very short list, and your name isn't on it yet. Tell me, Julian, why were you looking for something on the library floorboards this morning? Losing your cufflink, or looking for a way into the ventilation ducts?" He went stiff, his polished exterior cracking for a split second. "I don't know what your spy's been telling you, but I was looking for a misplaced ledger. The gala's expenses are my responsibility." "Sure they are," I said. "And the toy soldiers? Are they part of the decor?" He didn't answer. He turned on his heel and marched toward the library, leaving a scent of expensive cologne and genuine anxiety in his wake. I spent the rest of the afternoon interviewing the staff, the butler, the footman, even the girl who did the dusting. Nobody saw anything. Nobody heard anything. It was as if the soldier had simply materialized from the air, but I did find one thing. In the mudroom near the garden entrance, tucked behind a row of heavy winter boots, I found a small smear of blue paint on the baseboard. It was the same shade of blue as the soldier's uniform, the Sterling Vane livery, and next to it was a single silver-headed pin, the kind used by tailors to mark a hem. I took the pin and scraped the paint. By the time I caught the train back to 35th Street, I had a theory that I was beginning to grow hair. I entered the office at 5:45. Wolfe was down from the plant rooms, settled in his chair with a glass of beer, waiting for the evening news. I laid the silver pin and the paint sample on his desk. "Pavement and pedigree," I said. "Julian is digging up the library, Claire is a nervous wreck, and Thorne is watching the walls. But I found this in the mudroom. It's the same blue paint and a tailor's pin. And here's the kicker, Wolfe. Claire Sterling's mother wasn't just Silas's sister. She was a professional costume designer for theatre in the 70s. She worked on the World's Fair pavilions." Wolfe looked at the pin, his eyes turning into slits of black light. He didn't touch it. "A costume designer, a woman who understands building a persona, and a daughter who is nervous enough to be ignored." "It gets better," I said. "I checked those security logs you wanted. The night Silas Vane died in 74, the man who was driving the other car wasn't just a stranger. He was the tailor who made the livery for the Varney estate. a man who supposedly died in the crash, but his body was never recovered from the river. Wolfe leaned back, the chair groaning in a long, low protest. "The plot is no longer a circle, Archie. It is a straight line stretching back 50 years. The intruder isn't just a thief. They are a ghost who has finally come home to collect a debt. Call Mrs. Sterling Vane. Tell her I want a private viewing of the Star of Aquitaine tonight, and tell her to bring the niece. I want to see how Claire reacts to a ghost." The south room at the Highstone estate was a place where shadows seemed to have more substance than the furniture. It was a secondary gallery, usually reserved for the less ostentatious pieces of the Sterling Vane collection, but tonight it felt like the staging area for a haunting. Mrs. Evelyn Sterling Vane stood by the velvet-draped window, her profile as sharp as a flint blade against the moonlight. Beside her, Claire Sterling looked like she was trying to disappear into the upholstery of a Louis XIV chair, her fingers once again engaged in a frantic battle with her diamond ring. I had driven the two of them back to the estate after a brief, cryptic meeting at the brownstone, where Wolfe had done nothing but stare at them for 20 minutes before ordering us all to Riverdale. Wolfe himself, of course, was not present. He was back on 35th Street, likely enjoying a snack of pâté and beer, but he had sent me with his eyes, ears, and occasionally his hands. I had Saul Panzer positioned in the hallway, still in his waiter's disguise, and Marcus Thorne was locked in his security hub, brooding over his monitors. "Mr. Goodwin," Evelyn said, her voice brittle, "I do not understand the purpose of this vigil. Mr. Wolfe insisted we meet in this room at this hour, but he has provided no explanation. If this is a theatrical ploy to unmask a thief, I find it tedious." "Wolfe doesn't do tedious, Mrs. Sterling Vane," I said, leaning against the doorframe. "He is methodical. This room has the only unobstructed view of the old livery stables, doesn't it? The ones that were converted into the guest house back in 75? Claire gasped, a small, choked sound. "Why are you talking about the stables? Nobody goes down there. They've been boarded up since the accident. Since the tailor went into the river," I said, watching her closely. "Funny thing about that accident. The logs say the car went off the bridge, but the tire tracks on the old stable road were never explained. And that tailor, the one who made the blue and gold uniforms, was a bit of a local legend for his craftsmanship. He could sew a secret pocket into a coat so well you'd never know it was there. I wonder if he could sew a secret into a life just as easily." The room grew colder, or maybe it was just the silence stretching thin. Suddenly the internal intercom on the wall buzzed. It was Marcus Thorne, and he sounded like he was being strangled. "Goodwin, get to the vault gallery now. The sensors just went flatline, all of them. It's a total blackout." I didn't wait for the ladies. I sprinted down the long carpeted corridor, my hand moving instinctively toward the shoulder holster under my jacket. When I reached the gallery, I found it plunged into a darkness so thick it felt like velvet. I clicked on my heavy-duty flashlight, the beam cutting a violent path through the gloom. The vault door was wide open. Not blown, not forced, simply open, as if it had been invited to do so. I stepped inside the small reinforced chamber. The pedestal was empty. The Star of Aquitaine, a sapphire the size of a pigeon's egg and worth enough to buy a fleet of yachts, was gone. In its place sat the third toy soldier. This one was different. It was an officer in a tattered coat, his face painted with a single crimson tear, and pinned to the velvet base was a small silver-headed tailor's pin. "Thorne!" I yelled, my voice echoing off the marble. "Get the perimeter lights on. Nobody leaves the grounds." "I can't," Thorne's voice cracked over my portable radio. "The entire system has been bypassed from an internal hardline. Whoever is doing this isn't just a thief. They're a ghost in the machine. They're running a loop on the monitors. I'm looking at an empty gallery on my screen while you're standing in it." I ran back to the south room. Evelyn was still by the window, but Claire was gone. The chair was empty, and the French doors leading to the terrace were swaying in the freezing wind. I looked out onto the lawn. A single set of tracks was visible in the light dusting of snow, leading straight toward the old livery stables. I didn't call for Thorne. He was useless behind a dead monitor. I followed the tracks, my flashlight beam dancing over the white ground. The stables were a dark, looming shape against the Riverdale cliffs. The boards over the main door had been pried away, leaving a jagged gap like a broken tooth. I stepped inside, the smell of old hay and dry rot hitting me instantly. "Claire!" I shouted, my voice low. "It's over. Sapphire won't buy you out of this. Wolfe already knows about the tailor." A soft light flickered in the back of the stable. I moved toward it, my boots silent on the dirt floor. In a small cleared space I found Claire Sterling. She was sitting on a crate, holding the Star of Aquitaine in her palm. But she wasn't alone. Standing in the shadows behind her was a figure in a long, antiquated coat, the blue and gold livery of the Varney estate, faded and worn. "He didn't die," Claire whispered, her voice devoid of emotion. "He just stayed, waiting for 50 years to pass, waiting for the family to forget his name so he could take back what Silas stole." The figure stepped into the light. It was a man who looked like he was made of parchment and shadow. He held a long silver needle in one hand and a wooden soldier in the other. He didn't look like a thief. He looked like a man finishing a garment he had started decades ago. "The star is cold, Mr. Goodwin," the old man said, his voice a dry rustle. "But the debt is finally warm. Tell Mr. Wolfe the tailoring is complete." I reached for the sapphire, but as I did, the old man vanished into the darkness of the stalls as if he had never been there at all. Claire didn't move. She just handed me the stone, her eyes fixed on the empty air. I knew then that trespassing was not just physical. Someone had been living in the cracks of the Sterling Bane history for 50 years, and tonight they had finally stepped through the wall. I walked back to the house, the sapphire heavy in my pocket. When I called the brownstone, Wolfe answered the first ring. "I have the stone," I said, "and I have a ghost. He was in the stables, Wolfe, just like you thought." "It was never about the stone, Archie," Wolfe said, and I could hear the sound of a beer bottle being opened in the background. "It was about fitting the coat. Bring the niece and the sapphire. Final fitting will be at the office tomorrow morning, and tell Fritz we shall need a very sturdy lunch. Revenge is a heavy dish to digest." The morning after the blackout at Highstone felt like the day after a fever had broken, leaving everyone exhausted but still shivering. I had Claire Sterling tucked away in the front room of the brownstone, where she was currently being kept company by a glass of milk and the unsettling silence of the hallway. The Star of Aquitaine was in the wall safe behind the painting of the waterfall in Wolfe's office, and for the first time since this whole mess started, the toy soldiers had stopped appearing. Wolfe was at his desk, but he wasn't reading. He was leaning back, his eyes closed and his fingers interlaced over his center of gravity, which is a considerable area. He was waiting for Saul Panzer. When the doorbell finally rang at 10:15, it wasn't the rhythmic chime of a visitor, it was the short, sharp signal Saul uses when he's carrying something more important than a grocery list. I let him in, and Saul looked like he'd been dragged through a mile of wet gravel. His coat was damp, his cap was limp, and his eyes were bloodshot. He didn't say a word to me as he walked into the office, but he headed straight for Wolfe's desk and placed a small, tarnished brass key on the blotter. "It wasn't in the stables, Mr. Wolfe," Saul said, his voice husky from the cold. "Goodwin saw the ghost in the stables, but the ghost didn't sleep there. I spent the night tracking the draft. In a house that big with that much stone, there's always a draft where there shouldn't be one. I found it in the basement behind the old furnace. There's a crawl space that leads to a service tunnel Silas Vane had built in the 20s. It connects the main house to the old gatekeeper's lodge." Wolfe opened one eye. He looked at the key as if it were a particularly interesting specimen of beetle. "And the lodge, Saul? Who has been the tenant of that neglected structure?" "On paper, nobody," Saul replied, taking the chair I offered him. "But utility records tell another story. Small, steady draws of electricity and water for the last 30 years. The bills were being paid out of a blind trust established by Silas Vane himself 6 months before he died. And the man living there isn't a ghost. He's a tailor named Elias Vance. He's 84 years old and he hasn't left that property since the Ford administration." I whistled through my teeth. "So Silas didn't kill him in the crash. He hid him. He bought a man's life and stashed him in the backyard like a piece of lawn furniture. But why the soldiers and why now? Because the trust is dry, Archie, Wolfe said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. Silas Vane's generosity had a shelf life. With the recent audit of the Sterling Vane estate, the one Julian Vane was so eager to facilitate, the blind trust was flagged for liquidation. Elias Vance was about to be evicted from the only grave he's known for half a century. The soldiers weren't just a challenge, they were a cry for recognition. He wanted to be seen before he was extinguished. "There's more," Saul added, leaning forward. "I found the workshop. It's in the lodge's attic. He's been making those soldiers for decades, hundreds of them. But he hasn't just been carving wood, he's been listening. That service tunnel runs right beneath the library and the vault gallery. He didn't need a code to open that vault, Mr. Wolfe. He knew the tumblers by the sound they made through the floorboards. He's been practicing that heist for 50 years. "And Claire?" I asked. "How does the niece fit into the tailoring?" "She found him," Wolfe said, sitting up and reaching for his beer. "Years ago, I suspect. A lonely child exploring the forbidden corners of a cold estate, she found a grandfatherly figure in the woods who told her stories of the old days, of the blue and gold livery, and of the man who stole his life. She didn't help him steal the sapphire out of greed, Archie. She helped him out of a misplaced sense of romantic justice. She was the one who provided the loop for the security cameras. She's been studying Thorne's system under the guise of being a nervous girl interested in the family's protection. So we have a thief who's 100 years old, and a niece who's a traitor to her aunt," I muttered, "and a head of security who couldn't find a tunnel if he was standing in it. What's the move, Wolfe? We have the stone. We could just hand it back, tell Evelyn the truth, and let her deal with her own ghosts." "No," Wolfe said, his eyes flashing with a sudden cold fire. "That would be an abdication of logic. Mrs. Sterling Vane hired me to identify the intruder. I have done so. But the intruder is not the villain of this piece. He is the victim of a 50-year-old fraud. Silas Vane did not hide Elias Vance to protect him. He hid him because Elias knew the Star of Aquitaine was a fake." I sat in my chair. "A fake? You mean I've been carrying a piece of blue glass in my pocket all night? The real Star was sold in 1974 to settle Silas's gambling debts," Wolfe said, gesturing toward the safe. "The one you recovered is a masterpiece of lapidary work, likely commissioned by Silas from a contact in the World's Fair's jewelry pavilion. Elias Vance knew because he was the one who transported the real stone to the buyer. The accident was an attempt to silence him. When it failed, Silas offered him a different kind of silence, a house, a living, and a secret. But Elias kept the receipts, literally." Wolfe turned to Saul. "Saul, go back to the lodge. There is a ledger. It will be hidden in the lining of a coat, Elias's masterwork. Bring it to me. And Archie, call the High Stone residents. Tell them the final curtain is rising. I want them all here at 2 o'clock, including the tailor." "The tailor?" I asked. "He's 84, Wolfe. You want me to kidnap an old man from a gatehouse?" "He will come voluntarily," Wolfe said, opening his book again. "Tell him the suit is ready for the final fitting." The transition from the morning's revelations to the afternoon's confrontation was marked by a shift in the very atmosphere of the brownstone. It was no longer a place of inquiry, it had become a court of record. I spent the intervening hours coordinating a logistical operation that felt more like moving chess pieces into a killing box. Saul had gone back to Riverdale to collect the ledger and the man who had written it, while I made the rounds on the telephone. I didn't ask the Sterling Vanes to come. I informed them that their presence was required to settle a matter of grand larceny and historical fraud. Julian blustered about his lawyers, and Evelyn remained as cold as a statue. But they both knew that once Nero Wolfe starts ringing the bell, the only way to stop the noise is to show up. By 1:45, the foyer was a study in high-tension silence. I had Claire Sterling in the front room, still looking like a ghost, while I waited for the rest of the party. When the doorbell rang, it was Marcus Thorne, looking like he'd been chewed up by his own security monitors. He didn't even look at me as he stomped into the office and took a seat as far from Wolfe's desk as possible. 5 minutes later, Evelyn and Julian arrived, bringing with them a gust of freezing air and enough arrogance to fill a stadium. Wolfe didn't acknowledge them. He was busy with a sprig of cattleya on his desk, examining the petals with a magnifying glass as if the secret to the universe was hidden in the pigment. He let them settle into the chairs I'd arranged in a semicircle, the red leather chair for Evelyn, the yellow chair for Julian, and a sturdy oak chair for the man who hadn't arrived yet. The silence stretched. It was the kind of silence that makes people want to confess to crimes they haven't even thought of yet. "Mr. Wolfe," Evelyn said finally, her voice like a thin sheet of ice cracking, "you sent word that the intruder had been identified and the stone recovered. Why are we sitting here in the dark?" "The light is sufficient, madam," Wolfe replied, not looking up from his flower. "The darkness you refer to is internal. We are waiting for the final member of our ensemble. Ah, there he is now." The doorbell rang again, short and sharp. I went to the door and found Saul Panzer. He wasn't alone. Beside him stood a man who looked like he had been preserved in amber since the mid-70s. Elias Vance was small, thin, and carried himself with a dignity that made Julian's expensive suit look like cheap rags. He was wearing a navy blue coat with gold piping, the old livery of the Vanner estate, and he held a leather-bound book in his hands as if it were a holy text. I led them into the office. The reaction was instantaneous. Evelyn Sterling Vane became white, her hand flying to her throat as if she'd seen a corpse walk through the door. Julian looked confused, then horrified as the recognition set in. Marcus Thorne simply stared, his mouth hanging open. "Elias?" Evelyn whispered. It isn't possible. The impossible is merely the neglected, Mrs. Sterling Vane," Wolfe said, finally putting down his magnifying glass. "Elias Vance has been the tenant of your gatehouse for 50 years. He was the tailor who made your husband's secrets into a comfortable fit, and today he is here to show us the seams." Wolfe gestured toward the oak chair, and the old man sat. He didn't look at the family, he looked at Wolfe with the calm, steady gaze of a man who had waited half a century for this conversation. Saul took his post by the door, and I sat at my desk, my notebook open and my pen ready. The net was as tight as it was ever going to get. "Let us be precise," Wolfe began, his voice dropping into that melodic, dangerous rumble. "In 1974, Silas Vane was a man of immense stature and even greater debt. The World's Fair was his triumph, but it was also his ruin. To save his empire, he sold the Star of Aquitaine to a private buyer in Amsterdam. But a man of Silas's pride could not admit such a loss. He commissioned a replica, and he used a tragic accident to dispose of the only witness to the sale, his tailor, Elias Vance." "That's a lie," Julian shouted, jumping to his feet. "My father was a man of honor. You're taking the word of a squatter." "Sit down, Mr. Vane," Wolfe snapped, the word hitting like a gavel. "Honor is not a commodity you are equipped to discuss. Elias did not die. He was bartered into silence. He was given a lodge, a pension, and a promise that his family would be cared for. But Silas Vane died, and the promise was forgotten by everyone but the man in the gatehouse. For 50 years he watched you live in the house built on his silence. He watched your niece Claire grow, and when he realized that your greed, specifically your audit, Julian, would lead to his eviction, he decided to demonstrate the fragility of your security and the falsity of your heritage." Wolfe leaned forward, his eyes burning with a cold intellectual fire. The toy soldiers were not just markers of his presence, they were a countdown. Each one represented a decade of his life that was stolen, and the third soldier, the officer with the crimson tear, represented the night he finally realized that the Sterling Vane livery was nothing but a shroud. "But the stone," Marcus Thorne managed to say, his voice shaking. "Goodwin found it in the stables. Claire had it. The stone Archie found," Wolfe said, "is the same piece of glass Silas Vane commissioned 50 years ago. The real Star of Aquitaine has been gone for 2 generations. You have been guarding a vacuum, Mr. Thorne, and you, madam," he looked at Evelyn, "have been paying for the privilege of being deceived." Evelyn didn't speak. She looked at Elias Vance, and for a moment The 50 years between them seemed to vanish. The old man reached out and placed the leather book on Wolfe's desk. "The ledger, Mr. Wolfe," Elias said softly. "The record of the sale, the signatures, and the account of the trust. Everything Silas thought he'd burned. I'm an old man, and I don't want the stone. I just want to be certain that when I go, the truth isn't buried with me." Wolfe tapped the book. "The truth, Mr. Vance, is the only thing in this room that isn't a forgery." Archie called Inspector Cramer. "Tell him we have a matter of historical fraud to discuss and perhaps a very old case of attempted murder that needs a fresh set of eyes." I reached for the phone, watching the Sterling veins. They looked like people standing on a dock watching their ship sink, and for the first time in the case, I didn't feel the need to offer a life jacket. The office had become a vacuum, the air sucked out by the weight of a 50-year-old secret that had finally been laid bare on the polished surface of Nero Wolfe's desk. Inspector Cramer had arrived 10 minutes ago, and for once he wasn't chewing his cigar or shouting about warrants. He stood by the globe, his eyes moving between the frail old man in the navy blue coat and the leather-bound ledger that was the physical evidence of Silas Vane's greatest sin. The Sterling Vanes were no longer a dynasty, they were a collection of startled individuals, realizing that the foundation of their vanity was made of glass and lies. Wolfe sat back, his fingers interlaced over his waistcoat, the master of the house in every sense of the word. He looked at Evelyn Sterling Vane, who remained in the red leather chair. Usually that chair is occupied by the desperate or the guilty. Today it held a woman who had realized her entire life was a curated fiction. She looked at the toy soldier on the desk, the one with the crimson tear, and for the first time her icy composure seemed to melt into something resembling genuine grief. "So the verdict, Mr. Wolfe," Evelyn said, her voice barely a whisper. "You have identified the intruder, you have recovered the stone, and you have exposed a history I spent half a century trying to believe was honorable. What is it you want now? More money? A public confession?" Wolfe's eyes remained steady, as black and impenetrable as obsidian. "I want nothing but the conclusion of logic, madam. I am not a moralist, though I find the lack of ethics in your family to be particularly tedious. You hired me to see who entered your vault. I have done so. But the law, as represented by Inspector Cramer, will have its own requirements regarding the fraud committed by your late husband and the subsequent concealment of Mr. Vance." Julian Vane made a move as if to speak, but Cramer pointed a thick finger at him. "Save it for your lawyer, Vane. We've got a ledger here that lists bank transfers, signatures from a jeweler in Amsterdam who's still alive and kicking, and a detailed account of how a man was pressured into staying dead for 50 years. That's more than enough for the DA to start digging into the Sterling Vane assets. And then there's the matter of the security blackout. Mr. Thorne, I'll be wanting your logs, and don't bother telling me they were wiped. We have ways of finding what's been buried." Marcus Thorne did not watch Inspector. He looked at Elias Vance. "I'm the head of security," he said, his voice cracking. "I'm the one who was supposed to know the secrets of that house, and I had a man living in the gatehouse who could walk through my walls whenever he wanted. I should have known. I should have seen the draft." "You were looking for a thief, Mr. Thorne," Wolfe said, his voice surprisingly gentle for a man who routinely treats incompetence as a capital offense. "You were not looking for a memory. You cannot secure a perimeter against a ghost when the ghost has a key that was given to him by the man who built the walls. Your failure was not technical, it was imaginative." Wolfe then turned his attention to Claire Sterling, who had been brought into the room by Saul. She stood near the door, her head bowed. "And you, Miss Sterling, you were the only one who saw the man behind the shadow. You helped him not because you wanted the sapphire, but because you recognized the injustice of his exile. You provided the loop for the cameras, you planted the soldier in the mudroom when Archie was distracted, and you intended to let Elias vanish with the stone so he could finally buy the life he was denied." "He was my only friend," Claire said, her voice trembling but clear. "In that house, everything is about what things are worth, Elias was the only one who told me what things meant. He showed me the soldiers he carved. He told me about the World's Fair and the blue and gold livery and how it felt to be proud of a craft. My Uncle Silas didn't just steal his life, he stole his pride. I wanted him to have it back. Elias Vance stood up then. He looked at Claire with a tenderness that made the rest of the room seem like a cold, empty stage. "I have it back now, little one. The stone was never the point. I just wanted the story to be finished correctly. A good tailor doesn't leave a raw edge. He trims the thread and presses the seam. The suit is finished." Cramer coughed, a rough, uncomfortable sound. "All right, we're going to the precinct, all of you. Elias, you'll come with us, but we'll make it easy on you. Saul, if you could help the old gentleman to the car. Archie, I'll be expecting your typed report by morning, and don't leave out the part about the toy soldiers. The DA likes a bit of colour in the files." I stood and watched them go. It was a slow procession. The arrogant, the broken, and the ghost, all moving out of the office and into the cold January afternoon. The brownstone felt larger as they left, the pressure of their lies lifting from the walls. As the front door clicked shut for the final time, the house returned to its natural state of intellectual grace. Wolfe didn't move for long. He sat staring at the Star of Aquitaine, which sat on his desk like a beautiful blue lie. Finally, he reached out and touched the toy soldier, his finger tracing the carved crimson tear. "Archie," he said. "Yeah, Wolfe, is the beer cold?" "It's perfect," I said, reaching for the bottle opener. "And I think Fritz has the lamb ready. It's been a long day of tailoring, and I'm about ready for a final fitting with the dinner plate." Wolfe nodded, his eyes closing in a rare moment of repose. "The truth, Archie, is often a very uncomfortable garment, but it is the only one that truly lasts. See the beer. I find that my appetite has returned now that the theatre is closed." The office was finally empty of the sterling veins, but the air still held the faint, lingering scent of Evelyn's expensive perfume and the stale, cold odour of Julian's panic. Inspector Cramer had departed with his prize, not the sapphire, which sat on the desk like a discarded marble, but the ledger that would likely dismantle a New York dynasty. I stood by the window and watched the black sedans pull away from the curb, their tires crunching on the thin skin of ice that had formed over 35th Street. The streetlights were flickering to life, casting long, lonely shadows across the sidewalk. I turned back to the room. Nero Wolfe hadn't moved. He was leaning back in his chair, his eyes closed, his vast chest rising and falling in a slow, rhythmic cadence. He looked less like a detective who had just solved a 50-year-old mystery and more like a mountain that had successfully weathered a particularly annoying storm. On the desk, the toy soldier with the crimson tear stood guard over the fake sapphire. It was a strange victory. We hadn't caught a murderer or stopped a bank heist. We had simply exposed a tailor's secret and a dead man's shame. "Well," I said, breaking the silence as I dropped into my swivel chair, "the Star of Aquitaine turns out to be a star of the local glassworks. I hope Evelyn has a good jeweller on speed dial, though I suspect she's going to be too busy with the district attorney to worry about her accessories. Do you think Cramer will actually go through with the charges? Silas Vane has been dead for years, and Elias Vance isn't exactly a vengeful witness." Wolfe opened his eyes, but he didn't look at me. He looked at the sapphire. "The charges are secondary, Archie. The true punishment for a woman like Evelyn Sterling Vane is the public realization that her prestige was bought with a forgery. She has lived half a century as the custodian of a legend. To discover that she was merely the warden of a vacuum is a blow that no court of law can replicate. As for Elias Vance, he does not seek a conviction. He sought a witness. He found one." "He found the best one in the business," I said, "but it's a hell of a thing, 50 years in a gatehouse, carving wood and listening to the floorboards. I don't know if I should admire his patience or call for the men in white coats. He could have just walked to a newspaper office in 1980 and ended it." "No," Wolfe said, his voice a deep rumble of certain science as a craftsman, a tailor. He understands that a garment is not finished until every thread is in place and the fit is exact. Had he spoken 40 years ago, Silas Vane would have crushed him with his influence and his lawyers. He waited until the Sterling Vane edifice was brittle. He waited for a moment of vulnerability, the audit, the gala, the arrogance of the next generation. He didn't just want to be heard, he wanted to be undeniable. I reached over and picked up the toy soldier. It was light, the wood dry and aged. He did a good job on these. Every one of them is perfect. It's a shame he spent his talent on toys for a family that didn't even know he existed. They were not toys, Archie. They were markers of time. Each soldier was a day of his life he was taking back. The third soldier was at the end of the line. It was the moment he decided that the blue and gold livery no longer fit the house. Wolfe shifted his weight, the chair groaning in protest. The mechanics of the deception were elegant in their simplicity. Loop over security cameras, use of the service tunnel, Nice's cooperation. It was a masterpiece of strategic maneuvering. It relied not on force, but on the predictable failures of the people inside the walls. Including Marcus Thorne, I added. I almost feel sorry for him. The guy will be the laughter of every security firm in the country. He was looking for a high-tech super thief and got outplayed by an octogenarian with a silver needle and a hobby. Mr. Thorne's failure was the most common of all, Wolfe remarked. He assumed that because a man is old and invisible, he is also irrelevant. He forgot that a house is not just its walls and its sensors, it is its history. Elias Vance was part of that history. He was a ghost who still had a key. Wolfe reached out and rang the bell on his desk. A moment later, Fritz appeared in the doorway, his face bright with the knowledge that the office was finally clear of the elegant intruders. "Yes, Mr. Wolfe? Fritz, the omelette aux Feinsherbers was a success, but the day has been taxing. For dinner, I believe we shall require something more substantial. The canard à l'orange, perhaps? And tell Theodore I shall be up at 9 tomorrow. I have neglected the odontoglossum long enough for 1 week. Certainly, monsieur, Fritz said with a slight bow. He glanced at me, and I gave him a wink. The brownstone was returning to its orbit. I watched Fritz disappear back toward the kitchen. I looked at the check Evelyn had signed earlier, the $20,000 fee that would keep our orchids in peat moss and our beer fridge full for a good long while. It was a high price for a piece of glass and a few wooden soldiers, but in this house we don't charge for the objects, we charge for clarity. I stood up and stretched, my joints popping after a day of Riverdale chills and office tension. I'll get the stone back in the safe for the night. I suppose Cramer will want it as evidence eventually, though it's technically just a very expensive paperweight now. Do you want me to keep the soldier on the desk? No, Wolfe said, closing his eyes again. Put it with the others in the small cabinet. It is a record of a job completed. The tailoring is finished, Archie. Let us not linger over the scraps. I did as I was told, tucking the little wooden officer away. As I turned out the desk lamps, leaving only the soft glow from the hallway, I looked at Wolfe one last time. He was already drifting toward that state of profound meditation that precedes a meal. The silent night deception was over. The house was quiet, the secrets were out, and the only thing left to do was wait for dinner. The following morning, the brownstone had returned to its natural state of rhythmic, heavy-set grace. The January sun was a pale, watery disk hanging over the Hudson, casting long rectangular blocks of light across the office floor where, only a few hours prior, the Sterling Vane dynasty had effectively come to an end. I was at my desk, the typewriter clattering away as I finished the final report for our files. In the world of Nero Wolfe, a case isn't truly closed until the expenses are tallied, the bank deposit is verified, and the narrative is committed to paper with the proper margins. Upstairs, the elevator hummed, a sound that signaled the end of Wolfe's morning session with the orchids. When the doors slid open, he emerged with his usual deliberate majesty, his yellow silk vest gleaming under the hallway lights. He didn't look like a man who had spent the last 3 days untangling a 50-year-old web of fraud and tailoring. He looked like a man who was deeply concerned about whether Theodore had overwatered the dendrobiums. He crossed the room, settled into his oversized chair, and spent several minutes adjusting his blotter, his pens, and his glass of beer with the precision of a diamond cutter. Only when every object was in its rightful place did he look at me. "Archie, has the cheque cleared?" "Like a summer sky," I said, leaning back and spinning the deposit slip on the end of my finger. Evelyn Sterling Vane might be a lot of things, but she isn't a slow player when her reputation is on the line. Between the retainer and the bonus for finding the truth, we could probably afford to buy our own sapphire, or at least a very large pile of peat moss. Wolfe made a sound of mild acknowledgement, a grunt that passed for a cheer. "Money is merely a tool for the preservation of privacy, Archie. What of the old man? Has Mr. Vance been settled?" "I talked to Saul an hour ago," I replied. "Cramer is playing it surprisingly smart. Since the real theft happened in 1974 and the victim was a willing participant in the disappearance, there isn't much to prosecute without making the DA look like a fool. They've worked out a deal. Elias Vance is being moved to a very comfortable private cottage in Westchester, paid for by the Sterling Vane estate in perpetuity. It seems Julian realized that a happy, quiet witness is much cheaper than a noisy one in open court." "And the stone?" "The piece of glass is in an evidence locker at the 19th Precinct," I said. "Cramer wants to keep it there as a reminder that even the smartest people in the city can be sold a bill of goods if the packaging is shiny enough. He asked me to tell you that if you ever decide to go into the jewelry business, he'd appreciate a head start." Wolfe poured a glass of beer, his eyes fixed on the rising foam. "Mr. Cramer is a man of limited horizons. He sees the glass, but he fails to see the craftsmanship of the lie. Silas Vane was not a common swindler. He was a man who understood that human vanity is the most effective camouflage for a crime. He didn't hide the sapphire, he replaced it with an idea itself. Most people never look past the idea. Including his family, I noted. They spent 50 years worshipping a vacuum. It makes you wonder what else is sitting in those Riverdale vaults that wouldn't pass a vinegar test. But I suppose that's not our problem anymore. We've been paid to close the book, not rewrite the library." Fritz appeared in the doorway, his face bright. He was carrying a tray of snacks, tiny, perfectly formed watercress sandwiches and a bowl of olives. The intrusion of the ghost into the brownstone security had been a personal affront to Fritz, but now that the tailor had been identified and the logic of the breach explained, he was back to his usual hospitable self. "Mr. Wolfe," Fritz said, "the Canard à l'Orange for lunch is resting. I have also prepared ginger pears." "Thank you, Fritz," Wolfe said, his voice softening. "You may inform Theodore that we shall be having a late session in the potting room this afternoon. I find I have a surplus of energy." As Fritz retreated, I watched Wolfe. He looked remarkably content. The silent night deception hadn't just been a case, it had been a validation of his entire existence. Someone had tried to breach his walls, had tried to play a game of shadows in his house, and he had met them on the field of pure reason and won. "You know," I said, reaching for an olive, "Elias Vance was a hell of a tailor. He told me the suit was finished. I didn't get it at the time, but looking at that ledger and the way Evelyn folded, I think he was right. He didn't just want the money or the lodge. He wanted to make sure the fit was right before he left the shop." Wolfe took a slow sip of his beer and sighed, a sound of profound, mountain-like satisfaction. "The tragedy of the modern world, Archie, is that so few people understand the value of a finished seam. They are content with the ragged, the hurried, and the false. Mr. Vance was an anachronism, a man who believed that even a secret should be well constructed. I find I have a certain grudging respect for him." "Better him than the Vanes," I said. "They're going to be spending the next decade explaining to their friends why their family heirloom is currently being used as a paperweight by the NYPD." "A fitting end," Wolfe remarked, opening his book. "Now, Archie, if you have finished your report, I suggest you attend to the mail. I have a feeling that before the week is out, another person with a fractured history and an overstuffed wallet will be seeking our services. The world is full of raw edges, and they all seem to find their way to 35th Street. I turned back to my desk, the afternoon sun warming my shoulders. The brownstone was quiet, The orchids were blooming and the kitchen was safe. The case was closed, the tailoring was complete, and as always, Nero Wolfe had the last word. I started a new page in the ledger, wondering who would be the next person to ring the doorbell and try to outsmart the man in the yellow vest. Whoever they were, I almost felt sorry for them. "Archie," Wolfe said, not looking up from his page. "Yeah? Tell Fritz the ginger pears should be chilled, not frozen. Excellence, like justice, is a matter of temperature." "Got it," I said, grinning at the typewriter. "Excellence is served cold. I'll pass it on."